And we have reached week 6 in our study, The Truth About God. Last week, we talked about sort of an overview of Trinitarian theology, meaning how do we understand the proposition that God is one God and yet three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And of course, this became an issue pretty quickly in the history of the church because they had to explain who was Jesus, what was so special about him. And so for the next few weeks, we will be walking through some of the titles given to Jesus in Scripture. And this Sunday, we're starting with 2 of them, who seemed well paired: Son of God and Son of Man. Because, well, because they illuminate not only his dual nature, which is one of those things they were trying to argue about and come to a clear understanding of how he can have been clearly human, because people, touched him, interacted with him, but how he could also be God. And one of the things we will be coming back to frequently is this idea that, well, let's put it this way. Suppose there was a broken relationship between 2 people, one being the one who had been wronged, the other one, the one who had done the wrong. There is no way for the wronged person to restore the relationship. Or sorry, for the one who did the wrong to restore the relationship. That belongs to the one who was wronged. And in the sense of humanity and God, only God can restore the relationship broken. But in his holiness, he cannot tolerate sin. And so there was no one on the other side, on the human side, who could bridge that gap. So if Jesus is fully God, then he has the right to mediate from God's side. If he is fully human, he then has the right to represent our side to God, and to do so in a way that is at last, without sin, acceptable to God. And so he, as God and as man, becomes the only possible mediator to restore the relationship. And so let's look at, first off, Jesus as Son of God, right? You'll find as you go through the Gospels that more often than not, Son of God as a title is usually given by others to Jesus. One example, if you look at Matthew, the end of chapter 3, he goes to his baptism, and it says he came up from the water, the heavens were opened to him, he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him, and behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." So God himself declares, "This is my Son." So immediately thereafter, the Spirit leads Jesus into the wilderness. And what does the devil say? "If you are the Son of God." Twice he says this. So from the very beginning of his ministry, this title comes into play. Others, humans, apply it to him when they are presented with the startling things that he does that could only happen if he were not merely a human being. For example, when Jesus calls Philip to come with him, This is in John chapter 1, starting in verse 43. Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter, and he found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." So Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael answered, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Now, next week, we'll go into that, say, a triplet of titles, prophet, priest, and king, and start talking about how the King of Israel, the anointed of God, that Davidic promised king, ties in with the Son of God. But this time, just did you hear that? He saw something that should have been impossible to see. And Nathanael says, "You are the Son of God." You'll see this again when he calms the storm. And his disciples, in some of the Gospels, will say, "Well, who is this?" Rhetorical question. "Whom even the wind and the waves obey." But one of the Gospels, I think it's Mark, says they fall down and say, "You are the Son of God." But there are more examples of this. Mark 3, verse 11. Jesus has gone out to the sea, followed by a great crowd. And it's one of those situations where he says, have a boat ready just off the shore because people are pressing in on me. And so he's healed all these people who have diseases. They're pressing around him to touch him. And here, verse 11, whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "Guess what? You are the Son of God." You see this also in Luke 4. It sounds very much like this situation, but it's set just after Jesus heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law. And after the sun set, right, and the Sabbath was over, people came who were sick with various diseases and who had unclean spirits, demons, and the demons, it says, came out of many, crying, "You are the Son of God." One more example, which I find, it's technically two examples in one. The contrast has often interested me. At the crucifixion. In Matthew's account, right, starting chapter 27, let's start in verse 39. Those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Don't you find it interesting that it's the exact same wording Satan used during the temptation at the beginning of his ministry? If you are the Son of God. And then a few verses later, "Let him come down now from the cross and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God." Although technically what he said was, in response to, "Tell us clearly, are you the Son of God?" He said, "You have said it." Idiomatic, but never mind. But then, at Jesus' death, the centurion, Roman, not Jewish, not involved in the direct quarrel about who Jesus was, sees how he dies and the events surrounding it. And he and those who were with him were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Now, depending on what direction you're taking this from, there are a number of ways that people can understand being a son of God, right? For the Romans, this was not an unusual mythological concept. There were many in their pantheon who were the result of some sort of liaison between a divine being in the pantheon and a mortal person. And those quote unquote sons of God were neither gods nor men, and were never welcome in the mythology among either group, being inferior to the gods, who were very jealous of their status, and being an object of resentment in many cases among humans because of their greater powers. But that's not the sense in which we are talking about Son of God. In the Jewish tradition, the Old Testament does use the phrase son or sons of God in different ways. For example, if you remember the beginning of Job, where the sons of God assembled, referring to the angels and Satan in their midst. In Deuteronomy, at the very end, when Moses is reciting to them a song, before he has finished his second telling of the law, he uses a phrase referring to the people of Israel as the sons of God. If we look at Psalm 2, which is considered a messianic song about a Davidic king, we see, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, on my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. You'll want to keep this one in mind also for next week, because this is, again, tying that idea of the promised king when God made that covenant with David, saying, one of your sons will sit on your throne forever. The anointed one, called by God, my son. And of course, one more of these, Hosea chapter 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. This concept that God had chosen Israel as collectively his child, his heir, and then each one of them being a son of God. But there's something different here. The article makes a difference. A son of God, the Son of God. In the New Testament, this is used strictly, of course, of Jesus. And there is an instance, if we turn to John chapter 10, where, and we talked about this before, where Jesus says, I and the Father are one, and the Jews around him, they start picking up stones to stone him. And when he says, I've shown you many good works from the Father, for which of them are you going to stone me? And the Jews answered, it is not for a good work that I'm going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. And here Jesus picks up a psalm, Psalm 82, and he takes it and says to them, is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods? Now, if he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said I am the Son of God? If I'm not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. There is a special relationship here. And of course, John deals with this repeatedly. And even if you just go to the most well-known part of John, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Others can be made sons by adoption, but there was only one begotten of the Father, to use the phrases that they then hammered out at the later creedal conferences. Begotten, not made, God of God, light of light. So there is a uniqueness to this, and there's a significance to it. If you were to turn to Hebrews chapter 5, you pick up some of that significance when it talks about Jesus offering up, and this is verse 7 of chapter 5 of Hebrews. Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect. And of course, you have to take a kind of a side note on this one. Not that he was in any way lacking as the Son of God, but as the Son, and we're going to come down to this very quickly, Son of Man, as in his identification with humanity, it was his death that then, you might say, closed off, perfected that human life, brought it to completion. And it says, being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. So the significance of Son of God really lies not so much in, oh, yes, he was of a divine nature, though that is part of it, but the sense of obedience. Throughout John's gospel, what does he say? I do as the Father sent me to do. I always do what pleases him. As a son obeying his father, this perfect obedience, which of course is the only point at which he differs in his humanity from us, he then as is stated earlier in Hebrews, brings many sons to glory, adopted sons. And that is what we are. So because he was Son of God, perfectly obedient, while being of the same essence and substance as God the Father, like we talked about last week in Philippians 2, right? Being in the very form of or nature of God, he emptied himself. So when you hear or read as you're going through scripture, or you're hearing sermons, devotions, Bible studies, and you hear that title, Son of God, it carries with it the weight of his obedience. And the salvation that was made possible through that obedience. So how then does this title, Son of Man, weigh in this? Because he is both Son of God and Son of Man. Whereas Son of God is usually applied to him by others, Son of Man is most frequently applied by Jesus to himself. I've read that if you discount any of the parallel passages in the Gospels, right, there are at least 50 times Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. And yet, just like with Son of God, you would think that was emphasizing his divine nature when it really emphasizes his humility. Son of Man, you would think might emphasize his humanity, and yet there is an apparent contrast. If you turn to Mark chapter 2, we have one example at the beginning of the chapter and one at the end of the chapter. At the beginning of Mark 2 is that story about the paralytic who was lowered down through the ceiling to be healed. And of course, Jesus starts it out unexpectedly. Rather than saying, get up and walk, because that was the apparent need, what he said was, son, your sins are forgiven. And of course, some of the scribes sitting there questioned in their hearts, why does this man speak like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And immediately, Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, why do you question these things in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take up your bed and walk? Here's the bit that seems to be a contrast. But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home. And he did. If Son of Man is a title emphasizing his humanity, it's odd that he should choose to use it here. And again, at the end of Mark 2, he's going through the grain fields, and his disciples are picking heads of grains, and the Pharisees are nitpicking his disciples, saying, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus gives them the argument, right? Have you never read what David did when he was in need, was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to the ones who were with him. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. You see a pattern developing here. Son of Man seems to have more to do more than just his humanity dealing with. If it were just humanity, that would be, I would say, deep enough, because he was very much aware of why he was there. Romans 5 gives us a pretty good view into this, where Paul is talking about how we were saved by the death and resurrection and eternal life of the Son. And then he goes into, just as sin came into the world through one man, Adam, and death through sin, so death spread to all, because all sinned. But, so we have the first part of the proposition here. Sin came into the world through one man and tainted all. He says the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. If you go to verse 17, you get a good summary here. If because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace, free gift of righteousness, reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. So you have this idea that if Adam is representative of humanity in its sin, then Jesus becomes representative of what humanity ought to have been and can be once sin is defeated. He became humanity's one perfect representative and therefore brought life. But there's an interesting consensus that I found in looking up this, what different theologians have to say about this title, Son of Man. That consensus is that when Jesus chose this as his most frequent title, as it were, he was probably thinking about the book of Daniel. Specifically Daniel chapter 7, where he begins to have his visions of future empires, the war against God's people, and then the judgment. So as you go through Daniel 7, seeing all kinds of grotesque beasts and creatures, and then, starting in verse 9, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then, because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So if this is what Jesus was thinking about whenever he referred to himself as the Son of Man, gives it a different spin, doesn't it? Because it is very probable this was a vision of his triumph. When he had ascended back to the right hand of God, having defeated sin and broken the power of death, to receive everlasting dominion, an indestructible kingdom containing all peoples, nations, and languages. So it turns out that each of these titles seems to point in the opposite direction from what you would think. Son of God points to his humble obedience. Son of Man points to his eternal triumph. And these are things we need to keep in mind when we start to think about who Jesus is. When we say he is fully God and fully man, there is a lot to unpack in that assertion that he is co-equal, co-eternal with God, and yet emptied himself. Like Paul says in Corinthians, he became sin who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. But he triumphed, so that we might be adopted as children of God, and that we might share in this eternal, indestructible kingdom. So next week, we will be talking about Jesus in his roles as prophet, priest, and king. So I would ask for your homework between now and then, that in your readings, you would look, what does the Bible say about the role of the prophet, the role of the anointed king, and the anointed priest? All three are callings, shall we say, given by God, but they have different tasks to perform. So that when we come together next week, I hope that we can have some fruitful discussion.